you. Okay. Are you all awake? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Uppsala University because I didn't put them on the slides. But thank you for being such a kind and welcoming host. Thank you. All right, I'm from the National Library of Singapore. At the moment, I'm actually part of the Rare Books team. And I may look young, but I've actually had several decades of working at the library. And probably I look well preserved because I was with the Rare Books collection for nearly 20 over years. So it could be all the guesses, off guessing. Who knows? How do I press this? Okay, let me go on. Okay. I just wanted to look at a bit of the historical introduction of the library. And before that, I also wanted to let you know that Singapore actually was a colonial outpost of the British. Do you all know Sir Stamford Raffles is actually well known in Singapore and the region. So Stamford Raffles actually established a trading outpost, a British trading outpost as part of the English East India Company in 1819 on the island of Singapore. And he is the one who wanted to set up a school and a library, and that was around 1823. But his vision was not fulfilled. It was only in 1837 that the library came up. It was actually established as a school library. So the National Library had its beginnings as a school library in 1837. And it started as a school library and was only available to the students of the school. But due to public pressure, the Singapore institution, the school was called Singapore Free School. It became a Singapore institution. Subsequently, the Singapore Institution Library became a public library in 1845 due to public pressure. But it was still not free for all. Public have to pay a monthly subscription of about $250, which was quite expensive at the time, in order to use the library services. In 1849, the library's functions were expanded to include a museum of Malayan history. From 1874, the Singapore Library was known as the Raffles Library and Museum. So that's what you see. If you see the building at the bottom, that's the colonial building, and it still stands, thankfully, but it's now part of the National Museum. In 1960, the library has its own building, which is the building that you see on your right, which was actually red in color. I just put it in black here. And it's been torn down in order to build a new building. Right. Let me move on. Okay, this is the new building that I'm working in now. It's all glass. It's supposed to be sustainable. I suppose it is, but it does leak in the foyer when it rains. So I suppose we're supposed to collect the water, but we never did. It houses the Lee Kong Chian Reference Library. The National Reference Library was renamed because the Lee Foundation donated money. He was also the same person. Lee Kong Chian was actually a rubber magnet. He donated money in 1960 to build the National Library building, the one that I showed you earlier, and he made it a public and free library. So previously it was a subscription library. So from 1960 onwards, anybody can use the library. And they also decided to collect materials in Chinese, Malay, and Tamil, which are considered the official languages of Singapore besides English. So I also want to state that the National Library, which I'm part of, and the public library system are both managed by the National Library Board. All right, moving on. Okay, I'm going to talk about how the National Library survived the World War II. So when World War II came in, Singapore was still part of the British colony. So in Asia, World War II actually began on July 7, 1937, when Japan invaded China. That was during the Second Sino-Japanese War. But in the Pacific War, we know, began on 7 December 1941. So the Japanese launched their attacks on the Asia-Pacific region, including Singapore, in the early hours. It's a very early morning of 8 December 1941. And 2 months later, After fierce fighting between the Japanese troops and the Allied forces, the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese, and that was on 15 February 1942. The surrender took place at the Ford factory, which was actually the Ford Company's first motor car assembly plant, which they had just completed the year before. And the surrender marked the start of the Japanese occupation that lasted 3 years and 7 months. And of course, the British reoccupied Singapore when the Japanese surrendered. That was in 12 September 1945. And since 1998, Singapore has been marking 15 February 1942, which is the start of the Japanese occupation, as the Total Defense Day. And if you ever come to visit Singapore, you may like to visit the Ford factory, because that houses a permanent World War II exhibition on the war and its legacies. Interestingly, when they first started the exhibition, they called it Sionan Gallery. And there was a huge public backlash because Sionan was the name the Japanese gave to Singapore, which meant light of the South. So public were very angry because that was the name. It was a Japanese name, and it kind of invoked a painful past. So finally, the name of the exhibition was changed to Surviving the Japanese Occupation, War, and Its Legacies. So that's the image of the British and the Japanese, where the British surrendered and signed the surrender document. Okay. All right, so as I said earlier, the Japanese occupation lasted about 3 years, and the Japanese renamed Singapore as Sionanto, which meant Light of the South Island. All right, and Singapore and the surrounding region became part of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So what is this Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere? It's actually a concept that was propagated and developed in Japan, and it was kind of propagated to the Asian populations, which were occupied by the Japanese from 1931 to 1945. The idea was to create a kind of a self-sufficient bloc of Asian people and states that would be led by the Japanese and be free from colonial rule. So the Japanese were saying, hey, look, I'm coming here. I'm coming to free you from your colonial masters. And so it was a kind of a propaganda that they came up with. Most of the Europeans were actually interned in prison camps, and a few Europeans and locals were retained as civil internees. The reason being because a ship of Japanese technicians and officials sank. Yeah, they were torpedoed. So the Japanese had to use the locals and the whoever were on the island. The sad part, or the horrific part of the Japanese occupation, was that many of the ethnic Chinese were killed by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, through this system called sukching. It's actually a word to mean purging through purification. Okay? And there was already animosity between the Japanese and the Chinese. So whoever were deemed to be hostile to the Empire of Japan, or so-called anti-Japanese elements, were actually eliminated. And sadly, this Sukching massacre actually killed, I think it's estimated, about 25,000 to 55,000 ethnic Chinese. There were also other locals, the Indians and Malays, who were also affected. And mostly they were males between the ages of 18 to 50. Okay. And just about 2 weeks before the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese, the library and the museum building, which was actually the Raffles Library and Museum building, had been occupied by the British and Australian armies and was converted into a regimental aid station. Sadly, or it could be sad because they all died. The director, curator, and librarian had already fled when they knew that the Japanese were going to take over. They had actually already left. And so the library and the museum building were abandoned. It was believed that the director and the curator were drowned at sea when their ship sank. While the curator, it seems, was taken as a POW and taken to Java, Indonesia. Okay, so the library and the museum building were actually in a mess because when the Allied forces had left, there were damages on the building, and their books were extremely dusty, and some of the bookcases had actually fallen over, and many of the books were scattered on the floor, or they were even thrown out. Interestingly, this sign saying "Do not enter" in Indonesian Malay, "Di jangan masuk" is Indonesian Bahasa Indonesia. It was pasted all over the library and museum building. At the end of the war, minimal losses were suffered by the library and museum. The library lost only about 500 reference works, mainly through looting. And the museum had lost a few of its valuable and duplicate specimens. The reason for the minimal loss is basically favorable circumstances and the fact that there were a group of people, both Japanese and the British, who managed to rescue the library and the museum and the scholarly collections of the botanical gardens. And one of the British scientists was actually E.J.H. Corner. He was born in London in 1906, and he graduated in 1928 with a botany degree, and he was known for his extensive knowledge and research on fungi. He came to Singapore in 1929 and was appointed as the assistant director at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. He did mention in his memoirs that he didn't like Singapore because it looked like the backwaters, but he was really, really appreciative of the tropical botany that he could do research on. So he actually did a lot to advance understanding of tropical botany in Singapore and Malaya through his exhaustive fieldwork. He traveled throughout the region and he collected thousands of specimens. And he actually worked for 6 years to write his book called The Wayside Trees of Malaya, which described about 950 tree species entirely on field observation. He was also very dedicated to environmental conservation, and he and his assistant came up with this unique idea of using, trained macaques to go up on trees as high as 50 meters to pick seeds, specimens and so on. And he risked being labeled as pro-Japanese in his attempt to preserve the library, museum, and the botanic garden from looting and destruction. And this photo is actually a biography of Corner by his son, John K. Corner, who the father left him a lot of documents in his suitcase. So he titled his biography of his father as My Father in His Suitcase. It was published in 2013. Okay. So during World War II, Corner worked as a good and supply officer and food production officer in Singapore. And because he had a very serious monkey bite during his earlier work, and that disabled his right arm, so he couldn't be conscripted into the Straits Settlements volunteer force. And this also saved him from being interned in the Changi prison. So what he did was he actually took the bold step to appeal to the Japanese invaders to help preserve the historical and heritage collections of the library, museum, and the botanic gardens. And so he solicited the support of the Governor Shenton Thomas at the time, who wrote a penciled note for the Japanese. And Corner was allowed to live outside the prison camps and to lead what you call a somewhat ordinary life, but he was still identified as an alien and made to wear a red star. He was made to wear an armband with a red star, and he was made to carry a special pass that identified him as a foreigner but still protected by the Japanese. And due to his position, Corner actually helped to smuggle food and other items to the people detained in the prison camps. After the war, he wrote about his experiences during wartime in the book The Maki, A Tale of Sionanto, which was published in 1981. Okay. These are the Japanese officials who were sympathetic to furthering or kind of protecting the historical and heritage collections of the countries that they had captured. So first you have General Hideki Tojo. He was the general of the Japanese Imperial Army. He was also the Prime Minister of Japan for most of World War II, and he was known to be an advocate of education, and he issued an order that the contents of museums and libraries and all scientific collections were to be held and maintained in the countries where they belonged for the benefit of the people. However, his leadership was also marked by extreme state-perpetrated violence in the name of Japanese ultranationalism. At the end of the war, he was sentenced to death and hanged in 1948. The second person, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who was known as the Tiger of Malaya, he led the Japanese forces during the invasion of Malaya and the Battle of Singapore. And with his accomplishment of conquering Malaya and Singapore in 70 days, it earned him the title, the Tiger of Malaya. Okay, he actually ordained that no one was permitted to remove any book from the library without his prior approval. And he had ordered the do not enter signs, which you saw earlier in Bahasa Indonesia, the di jangan masuk. He actually ordered these signs to be pasted all over the library building. He was also convicted of war crimes and executed in 1946. The third person was Kaoru Toyodo, who was the Japanese consul of Singapore. He was a former Japanese consul, and he was replaced in later. He became, during the Japanese occupation, he became the president of the municipality. He was very sympathetic towards EJH Corner's cause when he presented Governor Thomas's note to him. Okay. Then you have Professor Hidezo Tanaka-date, who was a volcanologist and geologist, and he was appointed during the Japanese occupation. He was appointed as Director of Gardens and Library and Museum. And he was friends with General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, since his student days. So he began establishing the library as an independent department under high military authority in order to override the bureaucracy of the mayor and the municipality. So this allowed Corner lots of freedom and protected him and other European staff. Unfortunately, Professor Tanaka-date was ordered back to Japan because of his pro-European inclinations at the end of 1942. You have then Asahi, I'm not sure of his first name. You know, he has his Asahi. He was appointed as a custodian of enemy property and secretary to a municipality. He had the power to grant permission to enter buildings and collect abandoned books to be transferred to the library. So Asahi was a lawyer by training, and he had a special interest in conserving the collections of the law libraries. And the next person was Maki Yoshikika Tokugawa, who was a very close friend, became a very close friend of EJH Corner. And he was a relative of the Japanese emperor. And he was convinced by Professor Tanaka-date, who was his friend, to become the president of the gardens and the library and museum. During the Japanese occupation, he was also advisor to the Malay sultans because he knew Malay very well. Okay, and then we have Professor Quen Koriba and Dr. Yada Hanida, who took over as the director of the Botanic Gardens and the director of the Library and Museum after Tanaka-date left. And all these people were actually sympathetic towards the cause of conserving the library, the museum, and the Botanic Gardens. And it seems even the Japanese Emperor Hirohito was an orchid enthusiast, and he approved the decision to keep EJH Corner in his position at the gardens as well. So when the Japanese occupied Singapore, most of the institutions were renamed, and the library and museum were also renamed. The library was called Sionanto Tosyokan. Tosyokan means library, and Sionanto Hakubutsukan. And the books in the library were rate stamped in Romanized or Japanese characters to say that they belong to Sionanto Tosyokan. And subsequently, Professor Tanaka-date removed General Yamashita's notices and put up his own notices saying "do not enter." This was to prevent looting. So a lot of efforts were actually taken to make sure that looting was stopped, because EJH Corner found that not just the invading Japanese army, but the locals and the allied forces were also looting the libraries and museums and the gardens at the time. So during the Japanese occupation, what the staff did was they tried to hide the valuable books among the unsorted piles of less important books. Like there were some Chinese works, and there were also religious works. So these were not really looked for by the Japanese. And sometimes what they did, they stored some of the valuable books in the director's room because the Japanese soldiers wouldn't enter the director's room. And sometimes they also hid it in the rafters of the roof. So whatever hiding places they could find, they just tried to hide the valuable books. Some of the ephemeral collections, newspaper collections, and manuscripts were actually damaged during the war, but the Japanese occupation produced newspapers called the Shonan Shimbun, because all the local newspapers were stopped, and the Japanese produced the Shonan Shimbun newspapers, and these were saved by Kona because a lot of the newspapers were destroyed by the Japanese when they left Singapore during the surrender. And these newspapers today are actually a vital record of the dark period in Singapore's history. During the Japanese occupation, they actually started something called a popular library, which was only for the Japanese. And they also had a reference section. And interestingly, the library was mainly used by Europeans and Eurasians preparing propaganda for the Japanese to invade India and Australia. And because there were a lot of books that were collected during the Japanese occupation from abandoned buildings, there were a lot of light reading materials. So Professor Tanaka Date and the other Japanese officials allowed these to be distributed to the civil internees and the prisoners of war. And permission was only granted for one book per internee, but this was usually ignored. So EJH Corner ignored it, and he just gave more books than he should have given. But books of certain subjects, such as military affairs, politics, and geography, were not allowed to be distributed. At the end of the war, it is estimated that 5,000 volumes were supplied to the civil internees and 8,000 volumes to POWs at Changi Prison, which also included children's books. And Connor and his colleagues also flouted the rules by supplying music sheets, albums, prayer books, Bibles, even paints, brushes, and drawing paper. So during the occupation years, the Japanese occupation years, the library also played a pivotal role in protecting the collections of the institutional and private libraries of the colonial officers, consulates, law firms, and other key entities. So one of the things that Connor and his team did was they went around collecting lorry loads of books and journals from such libraries in damaged houses and evacuated offices. So by March 1942, which is like a month after the Japanese had occupied Singapore, more than 40,000 books had been brought into the library, which doubled. At the end of the year, they had 80,000 books had been rescued. And this effort continued till 1944, but with much less intensity. It was made possible because Professor Tanaka Date was supportive, and also Asahi, the custodian of enemy property and secretary of the municipality, was also supportive. He gave permission to enter abandoned abandoned buildings. And one of the things that was interesting was that even the Japanese soldiers got into this frenzy, and sometimes they would come up, they would bring their military lorries loaded with books and say, hey, we found these books in some abandoned buildings. Here they are. All right, so I just wanted to look at a few of the collections we have. Of course, we are not a war museum like Maria, so we don't have that much, but what we have is some of the things that were created in Singapore during the World War II period. And one of this is Leo Rawlings. I think the Imperial War Museum should have his collection. Yeah, so he was a budding artist. He was living in England. He joined the British Army as a private and was posted to Singapore in 1941. Unfortunately, he was captured and interned at the Changi camp by the Japanese soldiers. Rawlings had he has a very good memory. He was able to draw accurately from memory. So from 1941 till 1945, he actually completed over 100 paintings and drawings of the events he witnessed around him. So he was kind of unofficially commissioned to keep a pictorial record of the POW experience in the prison camps as well as in the death railway in Siam. So to make up for the lack of art materials, it seems he actually used his own hair as brushes and chalk, clay, root juices, mud, blood for color pigments, and to escape detection by the Japanese, which definitely meant death. He kept his drawings well hidden in his roll blanket or stovepipe under his bed. After the war, he exhibited his art and lectured about his wartime experiences. And in 1972, he came out with this book, And the Dawn Came Up Like Thunder, which is an illustrated account of his experience as a prisoner of war. This is a reprint in 2015. Okay. And this is another creative works by POWs. Even though they were living in such squalid situation, and it wasn't really a very good, it was quite horrific, the way they were living in the prison camps, and the living conditions were harsh. They did find time to have some recreational activities. So they managed to have singing sessions, or they put up theater plays, and they produced program leaflets such as this, and posters and singing booklets using whatever materials they could get. So the one that you see, Hell's a Buzzing, was actually a handmade program of a review written and produced by Leo Britt. He was an actor in London before he enlisted as a corporal with the British Army Service Corps. And this brochure indicates Japanese prison camp, Singapore, at the bottom, and was produced in April 1942. The other book, Changi Souvenir Song Album, contains 24 musical numbers that were composed during internment, and it was put to score after the war and was printed as a booklet and to be given to allied POWs. The music actually captures the despair of the POWs, their longing for home, and the various diseases that plagued them during their time. So these musical and theatrical productions were actually they played an important role in providing mental stimulus and raising the morale among the POWs. And here you have two books. These are by the locals, by two ethnic Chinese, who went through the painful Japanese occupation. Chop suey is a Chinese name, Chinese word. It means, it's actually a Chinese dish that's traditionally made with leftovers. So this is a multi-volume work. It's a 4-volume work. It contained the sketches of the Singaporean artist who was known as Liu Kang. And it actually depicted the horrors of the Japanese occupation. There were not many words, actually. It was just sketches, but it was enough to tell you that it was a horrific situation. Liu was born in China. Liu Kang was born in China. He moved to Malaysia when the Japanese invaded China in 1937. Then he came to Singapore. But when the Japanese invaded Singapore in 1942, he and his family went back to Malaysia. But he actually witnessed many war atrocities committed by the Japanese soldiers, and he sketched them out. His book is considered to be a limited edition because it's very rare to find a complete set. The second one is written by also an ethnic Chinese, but it's totally in the Chinese language. And it's actually a collection of cartoons drawn by the author Yang Shushen, who was a Chinese who survived the Japanese occupation. He was a painter from Singapore. He was a painter from China, sorry. And he came to work in Singapore just before the war broke out. He produced about 70 drawings that depicted Japanese brutality and the mass suffering. And it contains a selection of those sketches, which includes scenes of Sukching, as I told you, the mass screening and massacre of Chinese people, the rape, because the Japanese soldiers tended to rape the women, and tortures, public humiliation. As you can see, whenever you pass by a Japanese soldier, you have to bow down to them. And forced labor. His cartoons also depicted forced labor, forced resettlement, unlawful seizure of property, and corruption. Okay. I did not manage to include one slide on this donation made by Mr. Lim Shao Bin. Since 2016, he has donated over 800 items because he worked with Sony. It's a Japanese company, and he was in Japan for a while. He was also studying there. So he managed to pick up Japanese, and he got interested in Japanese propaganda materials that were produced during the Japanese occupation. He managed to collect a lot from the Japanese booksellers, and he has donated about 800 items of those, including maps, postcards, photographs, and other ephemera. Sorry, I did not manage to create a slide for that. I would just like to end my talk with this display. If you ever come to Singapore within the next 6 months, Singapore is always sunny, remember, so you can always travel light. Okay, and food is cheaper too. And so we have this display at the Rare Books Gallery for the next 6 months. It's called Light Amidst Adversity. It's to mark the Total Defense Day. And it has all the, it features some rare books, photographs, artworks, personal documents, and ephemera that record the local war preparations and poignant stories in a time of adversity. We actually also have archival materials. We worked with archives to display some of the materials, including the oral history interviews. It's on until the July 2023. Okay, so total defense is actually a defense strategy that was announced as Singapore's overarching defense strategy on 22nd January in 1984. So it was the Total Defense Day was first nationally marked in Singapore in 1998, 15 February 1998. So what happens is at 12:05 p.m., there will be a siren that goes on. But since 2015, the siren was sounded at 6:20 p.m. which was the actual time of the surrender in 1942. And with that, I end my talk.
Thank you very much for that fascinating overview of your collections and how they survived. Can I ask if there are any questions? Yes, Helen. Do you want me to?
There we go.
Thank you. This is a question for you, and I wonder maybe it might be relevant for Maria also to comment, because you've both shown us these collections which are about war and about, I know the really terrible things that happened in Singapore during the war. And today we talk a lot about content warnings and about saying to people what you might be seeing is difficult and problematic. And so do you when you show these materials or in your catalogues or if you're putting on an exhibition, would you put up any kind of content warning, or how do you deal with the fact that you don't want to censor the material but also it's got traumatic content in it?
Okay, thank you for that question. We have, okay, I think the first time that such a public backlash happened was, as I said, when the Ford factory called its exhibition Shonan Gallery. That was the public backlash then, but there was no public backlash to the materials that were featured, you know, and if you look at it now, most of the people who survived the war were actually very young kids at the time. And they witnessed their relatives, their loved ones being taken away. And some of them still remember such things. And they could be very elderly. They could be in the 70s and 80s. And I was told that some of them refused to even go to Japan or even buy Japanese products or even a Japanese car. So some people are quite adamant. But I think over the years, some have become, shall I say, I mean, I'm sure the wounds are still there. But when it comes to showing the materials, it's what it is. It's what happened, and they all know it. And the fact that that women were raped, and as I showed you, the Chinese cartoon book actually featured this picture of a woman, you know, almost naked, totally naked, with the Japanese. I don't want to show it, but it was like a woman, you know, she was like top naked, and the Japanese soldier is leaving, you know, the room. So that those kinds of images are actually quite sad. But so far, when we displayed that at the gallery, we've not had any feedback yet, because the thing is that this is what happened, and the only backlash that happened was actually the fact that the naming, the Shonan Gallery, they didn't want the name to be Shonan Gallery. It's like glorifying the painful past, because that's what the Japanese called Singapore. Although it meant light of the South in Japanese, it was still reminiscent. The name was reminiscent. But as to showing the materials, so far we've not had a problem. I'm not sure, Maria, whether you have.
Yeah, I think in Imperial War museums, we always try to contextualize that content. So obviously, we're not looking at it from a different perspective, which is, you know, our perspective today. But we have, for example, a lot of material relating to the prisoners of war in Changi prison. And there is a whole association, which is the Far East Prisoners of War Association, which obviously, they are very much witnesses to that, not just witnesses, but actually still carrying that memory forward. So we have to be very aware of, the fact of that memorialization, as well as how we would be looking at it today, to make sure that, we present those stories in the most inclusive way. And one of the things that we're doing at the moment as well is reviewing our terminology in the museum, because a lot of the content that we have is traumatic, and it's difficult, and it's sensitive in many ways. It's all the different meanings that you want to give to, sensitivity or, traumatic past. And so we're very aware of that, and we're trying to look at ways in which we can present that content without losing the context in which it was created, how we can present that content in a more comprehensive way, if you want. So, and people, generally speaking, you're always going to have what we call our core audiences that might be less receptive to the way we're presenting content now. But on the whole, all that generation is beginning, because of, obviously, all of them are, most of them are quite old now. Many of them, won't be around maybe, in 10 years' time. But new audiences tend to receive that content a lot better. And so I wouldn't say there is a backlash. Actually, I think what we're trying to do is to increase that dialogue between the way, the previous generations looked at the wars and the way contemporary audiences engage, with war and conflict, which is very different.
Question. Oral histories, any interest in collecting those from the children, well, who are now older adults, to supplement the collection that you have?
Are you asking whether we are collecting from the children who have become older now?
Yeah, they're in their 70s.
80s. Yeah. We have been collecting quite a bit. Some of them, would have been in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, we are also talking to people who would have been, who are children of the parents who went through the war, or who heard their grandparents talk about, these stories. So there are not that many people alive but oral history started a few decades ago, I think around 1980s or so. So we do have earlier accounts. So we have managed to catch some of those folks before they passed away. So that's lucky. But the problem with oral history is that trying to get to the person before they get dementia or become too old to talk. But yes, the archives is now part of the National Library Board, and they have the oral histories department, and they are actually going out to collect. And we understand that not everybody speaks English, because in Singapore, they also collect in Chinese, Malay, and Tamil, because the older generation may not be speaking English.
Women and those types of atrocities.
Wow, this is a tricky question. No, are you saying there's a dedicated office to looking at comfort?
In some countries they have started that, say in Korea.
No, not in Singapore. We don't have a dedicated section or department or one that looks at that, although the history of that is acknowledged.
In the interest of timekeeping, I think we will end this session now, also for the people at home, so that they can listen to our final paper. Remember your questions, and there hopefully will be some time at the end, but please join me to thank Margus again for your paper.